Welcome, Stephen, again. We're back for our third bad vent session. Things are getting very bad and sad, but also very Christmassy. We've got the mistletoe up in the Bickley household. You have a few lights in the background. Are they there 24/7 throughout the year?
They will be. I put them up for Christmas, but I'm not going to take them down.
They're never going to come down.
And I had a whole bunch of other lights that just burnt out on me just now this morning. So,
Right.
I'll go get some more. I love them.
We are today talking about the theme of time and history and the whole sense in which Revelation seems to move history towards its conclusion, or we see it moving towards its conclusion in Revelation, but there's sometimes strange ways in which the church has kind of interpreted that, or maybe not strange. I don't want to kind of get to a conclusion before we've had the conversation. But it seems to me like the question of disciples of Jesus have always asked the question of when, haven't they? You know, Jesus' disciples asked him, when are these things going to come about? Jesus would speak using apocalyptic terminology and language.
Right.
Would want to kind of talk about how back to the first session, the kind of end of an age, even if not the end of history.
Yeah.
His disciples were quick to ask when, but he never gave them a straight answer.
Well, his answer in a way was kind of to say, it's all the time. So he doesn't give because they want a specific date. And his answer is a little bit like, I think, to be honest, I think it's a little bit more like, rather than him saying they wanted a specific date in the future, and he said, no, it's always happening. It's always here. Satan is always falling, for example. The mighty are always being pulled down. The humble are always being lifted up. Like the end of the age is always happening if you have eyes to see. That's a pretty strong element. And I know that doesn't feel natural to a lot of Christians to hear that today, because we haven't learned the very same lesson that the gospel writers are trying to teach their original audience, we haven't learned yet. Which is to stop thinking about, to start looking and seeing what's happening around you right now, rather than always thinking that it's going to happen in the future.
So there's always that sense of, and one of the things that apocalyptic, or at least New Testament apocalyptic does, is it focuses our attention on, not bizarrely not on the future, but on now, and on a particular way of living in now. There's a kind of apocalyptic awareness almost of time means something, but not quite in the way that we kind of think it's hurtling towards this great conflagration at the end.
There's a kind of a future element to it. So, but it's not like this futurology. So it's not a future element like predicting the future. It'd be a bit more like if you and your family was really struggling, like let's say you were just feeling really oppressed by your job or your employer or something, or you were really depressed by a Donald Trump presidency or by the European Union or whatever it is that's causing upset right now. And then I could come to you as an apocalyptic Christian. I could say, Paul, Becca, don't worry. The regimes that you feel are oppressing you, they are going to end. Right? You are living, they always fall. Regimes always end. New things always come. Take heart. Don't be alarmed when you hear wars and rumors of wars. Right? And it is like a prediction of the future, but it's not a specific. I'm not saying on this specific date, the European Union will do this, or Donald Trump will do this, or whatever. It's kind of like that thing that you're really worried about, it's not permanent.
Although there are concrete events in history, though, even when Jesus, say, like Matthew 24, when he's kind of talking about the destruction of the temple and things like that, those do relate to concrete events within history, don't they?
So and the temple itself was one of those things. So one of the stuff about the temple was like this idea that like the temple was governing your whole life, your whole existence. And all of your identity and your destiny was wrapped up in your relationship to the temple. It was where you had to go to get forgiven for your sins. It's where you had to go to get healed. It's where the Jews would revolt against the Romans. It's where the Romans would set up statues inside in order to show their superiority over the Jews. Like, it was just the focal point of the entire world, their entire existence. And Jesus says it's going to end. Not one stone will be left upon another. Right? Like, that's part of, if you read his language in terms of apocalypse, he's just describing yet another system that nobody thinks. And this is what he refers to when he says, if you have faith, you can say to this mountain, be thrown into the sea. He's talking about the temple. That was the nickname for the
yeah.
We'll call it the temple on the mount now, right? And when he's talking about the mountain be thrown into the sea, the context is directly related to temple. If you look at that story, it's all about, in the Gospel of Mark, it's all about the temple. And that's part of what he's saying. He's like, these things aren't permanent.
Yeah.
They're gonna end. They can be thrown into the sea. They look permanent to you right now, but they're not.
But that really was an epochal difference, wasn't it? Like an utterly transformed reality in a way. I mean, the Revelation itself is full of temple imagery in that sense of it was this like connection and overlapping place between heaven and earth, and well, really lots we could talk about, but that when we talk about the system, the kind of human system that ends, but also a sense within salvation history that God is now interacting with humanity in a different way, or
they are spiritual as well. Like, what's the temple? Is that a religious thing or a political thing? It's both. What is Donald Trump? Is he a politician or is he a spiritual figure? Well, he's both. Like, all of these regimes, like, what is patriotism? Is that a religious feeling or a political feeling? It's both. It's all these things at the same time, right? So the temple was a real building, but it was also the symbol of what the temple stands for.
Yeah.
And Caesar is a real person with blood and flesh, but he's also a symbol of empire and domination. So, and Rome was a real thing, but it was also symbolic of all other empires that have ever existed. So the New Testament is just using both of those at the same time.
Yeah.
So it talks about the end of the empire. It is looking forward to the actual end of an actual empire, but it's also looking forward to a new way of thinking about this world symbolically.
To what extent would you say it makes sense to think about Revelation as dealing with the future? I mean, there are all sorts of different kind of schools, different approaches to the interpretation of Revelation, some of which say it as, I think, because we've started, and our previous two conversations were rightly kind of focusing a lot on not on Revelation as a kind of revelation of history. It's a revelation of Jesus. It's a revelation of who Jesus is, and then not and to the churches who were particular actual churches in a first century context. Yeah. So you need to root whatever reading you have in all of that. Yeah. But to what extent does it make sense to think of Revelation as a book about our future?
Well, we haven't seen the end of. We're not living in an era that has no domination and greed and war in it. So if like the early Christians, you find yourself in you look around and you think, how long, O Lord, will evil men flourish and good people be persecuted? Well, we live in that world right now. So the same kinds of prophecies, the same kinds of revelation that Jesus has to the churches, which is, take heart, I have overcome the world, or these things will end, or these things are actually evil. They look like they're succeeding, but they're actually evil. Those are revelations that are very good for me to hear right now. It's very relevant today. And I need to hear that future word of like, don't think that evil people prospering right now is the end of the story. They haven't defined reality. If you could see it from a cosmic point of view, you'd see that these rules of men are shaky and flimsy, and they're ending. And in some ways, they're already ended. They're like a tree that's rotted out from the inside, and it looks like a solid tree, but it's going to collapse at any moment. It's already dead. It just hasn't fallen yet. And that's the kind of imagery you get a lot of what the world would think is powerful and long eternal. And Revelation says, no, it's flimsy and hollow and it's already dead. So there's a kind of a future element to that. To say, we've seen this before and we will see it again. Right?
Yeah.
We haven't talked about it very much, about the whole idea of like pre-millennial and post-millennial and all that. Like, there's some very elaborate systems. Like, you think the book of Revelation is complicated. You try looking at the charts and diagrams that people have generated, claiming this is their clear, straightforward interpretation of the book of Revelation. Like, we've invented stuff that's way more weird than the Bible ever was in the first place. And there's lots of people really trying to like make it as if it's like a future history, as if it's describing the future really clearly, like with one-to-one relations. Oh, there's the locusts. So swarms of locusts, that's a helicopter.
Yeah.
The beast from the east, oh, that's China or Russia or whatever. And like, they just make all these equations one-to-one.
Yeah, and really that's been throughout the church's history, hasn't it? It's not like
they've never
got to do that kind of thing. I mean, there was a big spurt of it in the 1970s with that Hal Lindsey book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which was a New York Times bestseller. It's everybody knows about the Left Behind series and the way that sort of is really draws heavily on that kind of reading of Revelation. But it's been something that the church has done throughout its history.
You say the church. I mean, there's always been groups of people that have done this. It hasn't been the dominant voice. And only now, like in the last 50 years or so, we've watched the dominant voice when it comes to the book of Revelation become that left behind kind of thing amongst charismatics and evangelicals. But so we've always had people like that using the book of Revelation as their revenge fantasy or as some prediction or whatever. It hasn't always been the dominant voice. Yeah. And there's lots and lots of ways to read the book of Revelation. And there are some way more valid than others. It's just that the very invalid ways have become more popular in the popular imagination of evangelicals in the last 50 to 100 years. They've latched onto the crazies and they've turned the crazies into the mainstream.
Yeah, that kind of detailed schematic, but even for there's a long tradition, isn't there? Of, I mean, it was a very mainstream thing to do at one point to identify the Pope as the Antichrist. Not that the Antichrist is actually kind of a figure in the Book of Revelation, but in terms of eschatological thinking, this sense of, what are the forces ranged against the true people of God? Not, by the way, not voicing any kind of agreement with that, but the
thing is, there is something not the Antichrist, by the way, because the Antichrist does not appear in the Book of Revelation. So if anybody talks about the Antichrist in the Book of Revelation, you know that they're not dealing with the actual text.
Yeah.
The beast. There is something beastish about the Pope, by the way. It's not wrong. There is something beastish about large religious institutions that dominate the planet and that resist being changed. Yeah? Yeah. That's the beast. There's something beastish about the European Union. There's something beastish about the UK. There's something beastish about America. Like when you identify the beast as the large dominating group, you're not actually wrong.
The reformers, they were kind of like that. It was part of their kind of thinking that it was the combination of kind of religious and political power. Yeah. That they kind of see outlined in. I mean, even people like John Wesley, would say, Pope, Antichrist sort of things. Yeah. And it's not, as you say, it's not just anti-Catholicism. There was a sort of sense of extreme power being exercised without tolerating much.
Well, because the Catholics would say Martin Luther was the Antichrist, and they would do propaganda, and they weren't wrong either, right? Like, they're not totally wrong. They're all wrong and they're all right, because whenever you identify any large movement which people are just joining, like, and they're not really thinking about it, just these blind assumptions or mass popular movements or something. That, the mark of the beast is a whole lot of people who just adopt the ways of the beast in order to engage in the daily life of buying and selling.
Yeah.
They're said to have taken the mark of the beast, and it isn't some actual tattoo on their head or a microchip under their skin. To take the mark of the beast means you've adopted his ways. You've become you've become a willing partner in his ways. That's when you take the mark of the beast. And the 666 was the number for man. I don't really understand all the numerology of it, but it isn't like some really exotic Left Behind thing where they scan you and see whether you have the mark on your hand. It's more like, are you participating in the ways of the world, or are you going to stand against the ways of the world?
Yeah.
So it's really not that hard. If you're a Roman Catholic and you look over at these German reformers who have lost their tiny minds and they're running around and they're destroying all the institutions around them, and they're taking up the Bible and reading it for themselves, and they're applying a million crazy interpretations to one text, and you could look at that and go, wow, these people are just blindly following their own emotions. They're like the beast right now.
In a way that Revelation functioning kind of, I suppose one word for it, like a slightly technical word, would be is polyvalent. It's just, it can mean many things. It does mean specific things. The 666 thing is an interesting example, isn't it? Because there is this idea that if you set out the Hebrew letters were also symbolic for numbers, and if you write Nero Caesar in Hebrew, then the numbers are 666.
Right.
So there was a sense of this number relates to a very particular historical and political moment, and John was saying something about that. This is the number of the beast, is the number of the person that is oppressing Christians.
Yeah,
and
the emperor.
Yeah, but it's also a theological thing. It feels so with all the sevens in Revelation. It feels like sixes are similar to sevens, aren't they? Except they're one short. It's kind of, if 7 is perfect, then 6 is a kind of trinity. 666 is a trinity of imperfection. It's a kind of multiplied imperfection.
Yeah, exactly.
But do we just end up in all this in a kind of wonderland where we kind of make up our own?
Well, the fact that these things can mean lots of things doesn't mean that they can mean anything. So when you say a symbol can have lots of meanings to it, that's not the same as saying that symbol could represent anything.
Yeah.
So when you are applying the story of the Revelation and the symbolism to areas of power and control, you're on the right footing. All right. So when you recognize that the 6s are all about the rule of men, and like you said, and it's contrasted against the imperfect rule of man and temporary rule of man, because it's going to fall, is contrasted against the perfect and eternal rule of God. That's the contrast here. It's to do with ruling and reigning and kingdoms. And the Emperor Caesar, Nero, and his empire, that's the beast. And that's greed and warfare and competition and violence. And it's contrasted with the city that comes, the new creation, where people don't even need it to know where the emperor is anymore, because his light fills the whole city. And it's like two forms of rule are contrasted with each other. And one is the 6 is 6, and the other is the 7 and 7. And it's perfection versus imperfection. It's that kind of thing, right? So 666 doesn't just mean, like all these people, like in modern horror, our horror movies and stuff, they always go into the dark basement. The inspectors go in and they find somebody scrawled 666 on
the wall.
You're in some realm of the mass murderer or demon worship or something. Well, that's not what it was. It wasn't a magic number that was meant to evoke a demon and bring a demon up. It wasn't like that. It's not a satanic ritual. It's the 666 is like, anybody who's taken the mark of the beast is living according to the imperfect rule of man, and they are treating it as if it's their God. They're letting empire and temple and money and warfare set their whole identity. They're taking the mark on their head, right? When you take somebody's name on your, remember, like in the Hebrew scriptures, you're meant to bind the word of the Lord on your forehead.
Yeah.
Right? To show that, like, I so identify with this, that this is my identity now. Yeah.
So it's a kind of it's a symbol of idolatry. It's a symbol of
idolatry is a God is the one in whom you live and move and have your being. right? So if you live and move and have your being in the daily markets of buying and trading, or in your national identity, or in your identity as a civilized Roman or a civilized Brit or a civilized American, if that's your whole beginning and end of your identity, then I've now identified the thing that you live and move and have your being.
Yeah.
And that's God.
Yeah.
You've taken the mark of the beast.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because on one level, I mean, Revelation is very lurid. There are, this seven-headed dragon thing who then gives birth to another beast, who then gives birth to another beast. So this kind of this trinity of beasts.
Yeah.
It's very powerful, rich imagery, but also it has some very ordinary meanings too, doesn't it? It's like,
well, yeah, the seven-headed dragon is Rome. It's not even not even a thinly veiled allusion to Rome, because Rome has 7 hills around it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the seven-headed dragon is, well, right now, guys, we're dealing with, there's been lots of Babylons in history, but right now we're dealing with Rome.
Yeah.
It's the seven-headed one. Oh, I know what that one is. And it gives birth to the beast. Oh, wow, there's the identification of the beast with empire and domination.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
But I mean, this is interesting in this discussion around the numbers and the beast, because there are two ways of reading these always, aren't there? So
Right.
there is a way which is about it's the difference between decoding. So the sense of there are things in Revelation that do have a code. They are code for something. They are symbolic of something. And in fact, at the beginning of chapter 12, it talks about the kind of then John begins to see signs. He uses the Greek word for signs.
Right.
And it's really important to see that, because it's not saying he doesn't actually see. Well,
gotcha.
Is he talking about a actual dragon, or this is sign stuff?
Yeah,
This is not kind of real stuff in that sense. But again, a sign of something real. But even when you think about that kind of 666 thing, it does have a code. It is possible to look back in history and say, well, that meant something specific. That probably referred to Nero, who persecuted Christians in Rome quite brutally, and then Nero being symbolic of the power of Rome. But so that's a kind of code reading. There is also a kind of the wider meaning, the way that kind of reverberates throughout and becomes a lens through which we can understand power now. And the same is true of the beast. I mean, John is clearly identifying it with the oppression of Christians around them, around people he knew. It mentioned Antipas, was it last week or the week before? Someone who he actually knew, who had actually died.
Yeah, right.
And he's a victim of the beast. But the beast is also kind of reverberating throughout history as power exercised against innocence, or power exercised falsely, or in faith. So it feels like there are basically 2 ways of getting hold of this stuff. One is to say, look, this is all about code, whether it's code in the past or code in the future, and the left behind stuff is the code in the future type approach. Or there is this kind of sense of, well, actually, this is just, again, it's back to what you were saying last week about if you push it too hard for kind of like individual verses, kind of blow by blow, what does this mean? Then you actually begin to lose something that apocalyptic literature and John's vision is intended to do. It's like more to be experienced and shape our imagination than it is to kind of divide out half a verse here and half a verse there and work out exactly which year in history that relates to.
I think it's a little bit more like, so if Antipas was killed and he's a real person that everybody loved and they're feeling devastated, so John gets to say, let's look at the story of Antipas. He wasn't just a normal guy who was killed by some corrupt soldiers. He was a member of the martyr army of the Lamb of God, who is marching against the beast and all of the beast's followers. So he's turning the story, the well-known story of Antipas, saying Antipas was a real guy that we knew and loved, and he's one of the elders around the throne of God looking at the recreation of the earth, right? So he's saying, look, we're part of a story that's way bigger than just what's happening to us right now, so don't lose heart, right?
Yeah.
See it from a kingly or from a cosmic point of view. And that does come with some unsettlingness. And I don't think we're never going to know all the codes. If there ever was a time when everybody knew all of them, I don't even know if there was one. But we're not now. But some of the codes that we do know, like, so some of them are kind of obvious, like the dragon or the Nero. And some of them are less obvious. But all the ones that we know of, we know all have some connection to what we would recognize as politics and power, right? So, and the book of Revelation is all about that. It's about the rise and fall of kingdoms and things. So we're in pretty good standing. If we go, well, we don't know everything. We don't know what all the codes are, but the ones we do know, we know they're about power and rulers. So it's pretty good guess that the other ones are also about that. Yeah. And so if you then have groups of people that don't pay attention to that, then they're just flying off into fantasy land.
Yeah.
And they're not rooted in any of the things we do know about the book of Revelation. So I think it's more about trying to see power and the rules of the kingdoms of man through a cosmic lens.
Yes.
That's my key to it, or that's my take home point for the book of Revelation, is like, it's always about trying to see the current day historical situation through a cosmic lens, including our own today. Like, it doesn't, because when you think cosmically, you're not thinking necessarily just based on the here and now. You're also thinking about, well, like we already pointed out, that time even changes in the book of Revelation. So he'll tell the narrative, he'll tell the birth of Christ's story as if it's happening in the present, as if he's witnessing it.
It did occur to me, and we focused quite a lot on Revelation 11 last week in the story of the two martyrs.
Yeah.
And there at the end of that chapter, you basically reach the end of history at the end of chapter 11, because there's this point where the kingdom of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and God, and this kind of the temple, the kind of heavenly temple opens, and you see the Ark of the Covenant. There's this theophany, there's a sense of like God has arrived in his creation. It was like, this is the end of history. That's a picture of the end of history. Right. And there are other pictures of the end of history, which but we don't think of chapter 11 as a picture of the end of history. Just think of one, or it's tempting to think of it in a series of, or it's part of the sequence that moves us towards the end of history.
But it all starts again. Like, you're right. It gives you a vision of the end of everything. And then there's still another 12, 13 chapters left of Revelation to go.
Yeah.
So it cycles back again, and it looks at the things from a different point of view. And it is swirly. Like, sometimes it's telling you about the end of a thing. Sometimes it's telling you about how it began. Sometimes it's talking about what it's like to live in Earth right now. Sometimes it's looking forward to what the future will look like.
Yeah.
Those are all aspects of the book of Revelation.
And the following chapter, like the chapter 12 with the nativity scene, the dragon, the woman.
Yeah.
I mean, that is probably par excellence in Revelation. That is polyvalent. They're like, what is that? Is that a story of creation? Is it a story of the nativity, like Jesus' incarnation? Is it a story of Jesus' execution, his crucifixion and resurrection? And it feels like actually they're all there. But it does beg questions about, like, what, I don't know. It makes, so I understand, not an expert on it, but like when it comes to things like, people like the church father Origen read that as like a creative account, and even when you get towards the end and kind of Satan's binding, the millennium, we'll speak about that in a minute, but like that Satan has been bound throughout history.
Yeah.
Origen's view. Others say like Satan was bound. Augustine would say Satan was bound, literally referring to Mark 3. Satan was bound at the incarnation. Jesus tells us story of the kind of binding of a strong man, which the Church Father Augustine related to Revelation. So there are kind of questions of interpretation that kind of emerge that relate somehow to time. It's not a kind of time series thing, but I mean, let's talk about the millennium for a moment. This kind of idea in Revelation 20. There's a 1,000-year reign, which separates two battles, and there have been just various ways of approaching that. I mean, this is the pre-millennialist, post-millennialist, amillennialist debate. People might be dimly aware of that in the kind of background, or I mean, some people are pretty fierce on many of those kind of questions. But how do you handle that? How do you approach? Because that does seem to be kind of identifying a specific season or a specific. No, it might not even be a temporal moment, but a kind of. Not that I'm a dispensationalist, but to adopt that, there is a particular moment when it feels like there is a greater level of justice, or it's interesting that the city in there, because it's not the final city of God, it's not the New Jerusalem, but there's this reference to the beloved city, which feels like on some level that millennium speaks of human culture kind of redeemed and kind of at its best.
Right.
But how would you? I mean, I'm not saying.
Then it comes to an end again.
Declare whether you're a post-millennialist or an amillennialist or whatever. But I mean, how would you suggest? What's a good way to handle those ideas?
Well, you'd be surprised how far you can get just not thinking about it at all. Like, there are people. So I grew up in a world where a lot of my people really love that stuff. Like, I was taught it in school, by the way. I went to a evangelical Christian school, and I was taught this stuff in school.
Me too. I didn't go to an evangelical Christian school.
Right.
No, I did go to an evangelical Christian school. I didn't get taught this in school. Carry on.
So, and it would occupy it would occupy the mental space of a lot of people. Way more than Sermon on the Mount does, for example. And one of the things that I then noticed as an adult was the fruits of that were bad. Like, there was no fruits of the Spirit that came out of those worlds, that kind of conversation. Like, just endless, pointless fighting. It was like watching people argue over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Yeah.
It's like fundamentally flawed. Like, once I started to do some of the research, like Bible, like actual study of the Bible, rather than reading some self-published paperback. Like, the fact that there's lots of literature out there doesn't mean that these people are scholars in their field.
Yeah.
It just means that they published a book, or that they found somebody who would publish their book. Like Hal Lindsey and the Left Behind guys, the LaHaye's and stuff. They're not biblical scholars. They don't know anything about the original text or the original languages or the original history. They're building castles on sand.
Yeah.
In the air. And they take one that a lot, like the rapture is a very good idea. This idea that the rapture, that we're all going to be hoovered up into the sky. It's like, there is no one place in the Bible that talks about rapture. There's lots of little places in lots of different areas that if you have the idea that we're all going to be sucked up into the sky,
you can find evidence for
you'll find it.
Yeah.
And you'll say, oh, that's what that's about. That's what that's about. That's what that's about. But there's no one place. Even the most obvious one, which is in Thessalonians, where it says, and the king will, with a trumpet sound, the king will come back, and we will all be caught up into the air. If you've ever heard Tom Wright talk about that, it's very interesting. He's quite scathing about these rapture people, because he says even that verse, which everybody points to, it's the imagery of the king will break the siege, and his grateful citizens will go out into the open air to bring him back to the city. They're not being caught up into the air; they're being caught out. They're out into the open.
Yeah.
And they come back. So even that imagery is not about escape from this earth. It's about welcoming your king to this earth. But anyway, once you start to realize that, you realize a lot of this noisy argument about pre, post, millennial, it's, to be honest, it's a lot of castles built on very shaky sand.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, none of the voices who I respect theologically, academically, and morally, like really good people I know, or I've been in their rooms and learned from them,
are interested.
They'll talk about the book of Revelation. They're absolute experts in it. They love this text. They're not dismissive of it. They don't have a single position on any of that stuff. It's like it's like having a position on Lord of the Rings. It's like saying, how long was an elf's pointy ears? I'm a 3-inch camp. You're at the 1-inch camp. And we hate each other. Elves have 3-inch pointy ears. No, they don't.
I'm definitely the 1-inch camp. I'm definitely on the 3 inches. That would be utterly ridiculous. Can't.
And if somebody went to Tolkien and went, all right, Tolkien, which camp are you in? He'd be like, I don't have a dog in that fight.
Okay. Let me push back against that a little bit, at least, because there is a sense, like, when we think about politics, in particular, that our eschatology, our view of the end time, does affect the way we do our politics, both negatively and positively, isn't it? So, if you take a wholly kind of non-historical approach to an idea like the millennium, and this may be a bit geeky. If you're watching, you kind of like lost it, then talk to me afterwards. But if you take an entirely ahistorical approach and say it's not about something that's realized within history, then that, I mean, let me put it another way. It feels like a strength of, say, a post-millennial approach, which says Jesus will come back once after the millennium, and that might inspire kind of positive social and political activism, because there is this sense of a reign of peace and justice, which we will experience within history. So someone like Jonathan Edwards would have advocated that view, and even earlier in some of the early church fathers. But if you take the view that it's just kind of basically it's one big fat metaphor, and it doesn't relate to anything within history, then it feels to lose something about that. Like the peace and the justice that God offers is something that we will realize within the context of space and time, as opposed to something that's just a quote unquote spiritual reality.
Well, I don't know which one. I don't know if you. I'm not quite sure how you think that I'm talking about it doesn't have any relation to history. That's all I'm talking about.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying, is there a risk of reading some of these things in a way where we cancel their kind of real world meaning?
Well, you can't. Okay, here you go. All right. The coronavirus vaccine has a microchip in it, which is run by Bill Gates. That's the beast, and he's the Antichrist. Because I take the book of Revelation seriously. And I'm applying a real meaning to it. Like, does that view touch on reality? And is that view going to bear fruit based on the book of Revelation and what it was meant for? Well, my view, which is to say, the beast is any system that sets itself up, that captures your imagination and sets itself up against the rule of God. And that the beast is everywhere. It's not just Bill Gates and the coronavirus vaccine. It's the beast can be us right now. Vineyard Church can be beast-like in the way it runs itself. Pay attention.
Yeah.
Right.
But those, to a certain extent, those are straw men, aren't they? So
right.
Needs that. I agree that way of appropriating Revelation to give it a very present meaning, which is what a lot of Christians are doing all the time. That's a bad way of reading Revelation. But like some of those people that want to say, no, these events are going to be realized within human history in tangible ways. Like the revelation will actually be it's not quite that. It's not that simplistic, and it's not that kind of trite. That it is a kind of substantial, even if it's mistaken. But it feels to me like there are some advantages to that desire to want to kind of say, well, this is about stuff that's going to happen within our kind of space-time universe.
Ideas aren't. I mean, the Book of Revelation is what it is, regardless of what implications we make of it. Like, I mean, just pointing out the implications of a thing isn't the same as saying whether it was true or not. Right or not. That's one thing I would say. Yeah. It's not that hard to point to the same kinds of people that are really into pre and post and amillennialism and all that argument. They also tend to be the same kinds of people that think, why do we have to care about the world? We're all going to be sucked up into the sky anyway. It's all going to get destroyed anyway. So the social and political and economic and environmental implications of that kind of evangelicalism have been very bad. And they've led to a complete abandonment of care for anything to do with this world right now, because of this view of Revelation of like, well, it's all going to get destroyed and we're all going to get sucked into the sky, so we don't have to care.
Yeah. Like that view is a view of a particular kind of premillennialism.
Yeah, right. But like, those people who make all those connections between the Book of Revelation and current and future political events, it hasn't exactly led to them having a really engaged and positive view of engagement with the world either.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that it doesn't have any connection. All right, this thing about the millennial, like, I don't know. But I just don't think anything I know about the Book of Revelation tells me that very specific one-to-one equations fall flat eventually, because the Book of Revelation resists that. So even the most obvious one-to-ones, like the beast, the seven-headed dragon, for example, which is really obviously wanting to connect it to Rome. Yeah. Even the Book of Revelation itself says we've got Rome, but we've also got Babylon. He calls it Babylon, which now instantly links you to every other Babylon that has ever existed in the Hebrew Bible, which sometimes is symbolic and sometimes it's a real place. So Rome is the seven-headed beast. A dragon is the beast. It's Rome. It's Babylon. It's Babylonish. Like, even within the Book of Revelation, it stands for more than one thing. So I am weary. I'm weary and wary of people who say, well, it's this and nothing else. You're like, well, even the Book of Revelation doesn't say that.
Yeah.
So certainly I'm not going to, in 2020, I'm not going to listen to somebody who says, oh, I know what that symbol is. The 7 lampstands, that's 7 cities in Russia, or that's 7 Republican senators in that, whatever crazy thing I've heard. I'm like, no, it's not. I know it's not, because it never has been one-to-one equation since the day it was written, let alone 2,000 years later.
Yeah, I've wearied you and myself by spending too long on this question, but therefore, I think the pushback is in like these things are kind of, well, I do think that that is generally the right approach to Revelation, to kind of read it as kind of a theological as a lens through which to view all experience, but yet at the same time, like there are points at which I feel like Revelation is kind of resisting that, and this millennium idea is one of them. Right. But I mean, maybe I've overcomplicated it. What do you think the apocalypse is trying to reveal at those points? It's a kind of idea of before the end of all things, a kind of rule of peace. What is it trying to evoke?
Well, some of this stuff, like the 1,000-year reign and all this, I mean, these are again ways of evoking a completion or the perfect rule, or the reign. 1,000 years means just the perfect amount of time, or a really long time, or in the same kind of way that if you hear a fairy tale a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away or something like that,
Definitely.
we don't interrogate that phrase to absolutely, well, how far away, how long ago, exactly how many years. We recognize that phrase means I'm about to tell you a fantasy story.
Yeah.
So there are some of those phrases in the book of Revelation, which are things like 1,000-year reign, which means like a completely perfect time.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. So there's some of those sort of stuff that we're not attuned to that. We either there are scholars who are attuned to it and we're not paying attention to them, or we're just not attuned to it. There's nobody, we couldn't know that anymore. But there are some of those kind of phrases in there. And they, again, have to do with ruling and reigning. I would just point that out.
Yeah.
They have to do with living at peace, and then that peace being disturbed. And so don't put your trust in utopia, because even that will be destroyed. There's lots of, I don't know all the like reasons for it. I just know the bigger picture seems to be, don't put your trust in the rule of men, because the rule of men is temporary. And the beast always looks dominant, and it's always being cast down. Like that's its reality. That beast-like things are always being destroyed. So take heart. And those are the kinds of stories you get out of the book of Revelation over and over again. Yeah. But I don't know. I do know that I think a lot of the code, I think you're absolutely right. There are some codes in there, but I think a lot of them would be for people who are steeped in Hebrew scriptures and culture. And so it's not like a super hidden code. Like they would get it. A bit like if I said, once upon a time in Middle Earth.
Yeah.
I said that to you, you'd know right away where we're living and what we're doing, what kind of story it is I'm about to tell you.
Yeah.
Even if I don't explain, once upon a time in Middle Earth, little asterisk, Middle Earth was invented by Professor J.R.R. Tolkien in 1976. The book of Revelation just uses a lot of those phrases which it knows its audience is going to plug into, and it doesn't explain them all.
Yeah. So on that case, I'm less worried about 1,000-year thing. Like I remember I asked one of my children this morning, how do you think the world will end? And he said, well, in like 1,000 years.
Yeah, right. Which means an impossibly long time.
Yeah, it's just a long but kind of imaginable amount of time. I'm less worried about the 1,000 years than I am about the idea that before the kind of completion, this marriage of heaven and earth that the vision presents at the end, there is it is kind of, I'm trying to understand the theological meaning of that as a kind of period before the completion of all things, the renewal of all things. Images like the binding of Satan during that time. But I don't want to flog a dragon.
I don't know, but I do know that in general that it could be referring to things in the past as well, like periods in Israel's history when they've experienced peace, and it's like the book of Revelation is saying, look, it's a little bit, we're living in this time that it's now and not yet, and it's a little bit like it was in the past, and we all know that the rule of 1,000 years refers to this type of rule of King David or something. I don't know, I'm just making this up, but there's lots of parallels. He's making lots of connections, and he's drawing in, he's telling the life of the Christians now. He's getting them to think of their lives as if it's part of a bigger story. Sometimes he's drawing from events in the past, and he's saying, look, that's like what we're doing now. And sometimes he's drawing from things that haven't happened yet in the future, and he's saying, look, this is what's about to happen to us. You're part of a bigger story than just you right now huddled in Philippi or whatever.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that is said about the apocalypse. It's that Jesus says to John, I'm going to tell you the things that are now and the things that will be. Yes. There's a lot of it being mixed in.
Yeah. And Richard Hayes, this guy that I've plugged before, he wrote this really good chapter on the book of Revelation, but he calls it not just theology. It clearly is not just a theological textbook. It clearly is not that. And it's clearly not a history. and he calls it a theological poem, a theopoet. He calls it theopoetry.
Mm.
And he's like, I think we should live a little bit more the same kind of mindset you're in when you read a poem that's dense in imagery. I don't know, go read a T.S. Eliot, go read The Wastelands or something, a really complicated poem. And he said that's what the book of Revelation is like. It's swirling imagery, it's evoking your emotions, it's making allusions and connections, classical allusions, and it's making things up, and it's chopping and changing. It's more like reading a dense poetry than it is like reading a dry academic textbook. That's for sure.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, we are very nearly at the end of Advent. You mentioned a phrase a moment ago, the now and the not yet, which is extremely current in the Vineyard, which is our network of churches. The Vineyard talks a lot about kingdom theology, and the sense of, the technical language for that would be inaugurated eschatology, or partially realized eschatology, the sense that God is doing something that we see in part, but not fully. It's kind of being born into our reality in some way.
Yeah, right.
I'm just interested by your kind of reflection on what reading Revelation does to that. Does it affirm it? Does it pose some questions over it? Does it kind of enforce it? Does it say yes, but kind of transform it and say? I think the truth is that in the Vineyard, a lot of the now and the not yet stuff is a kind of it's almost a sort of it's a little bit of theodicy in a way. It's a way of saying God heals sometimes, but sometimes He doesn't heal. And
Okay.
How do we think about God? Yeah. Shouldn't He do that all the time if He's kind of loving? Yeah. So, but any thoughts on that, just to round us out?
I think that now and not yet it's got to be one of the most, if not the only, it's just got to be the most valid way of thinking about it, because it's a way of saying what you look at in the world right now is not the only story. What the world says about itself is not the whole story. It's not, they don't have the final word. And the power structures and the illnesses and the poverty and the injustice and whatever that we see right now is not the beginning and the end of human existence. There's more going on than just what we see right now. But we do experience it. So it's real. It's just not the whole of reality. And so when we say the now and not yet, we're like, the kingdom of God is here. It is happening right now. But not everybody has acknowledged it. And not everyone is experiencing it. So what we're saying is, like Jesus says, the kingdom of God is here. It's amongst you, He said. Mm-hmm. And that's not the same as saying every single person acknowledges the kingdom of God. And that's what we do when we are saying, the kingdom is real. We can live according to the kingdom right now. We can treat others better than ourselves. We can not have the orphan spirit. We can heal the sick. We can use prophecy to build each other up. We can live without fear of killing our enemies or being patriotic towards our made up countries. We can do all these things that show that we live in a new kingdom right now. Mm. And not everyone acknowledges this new kingdom. Mm. So it's now, but not yet. And that's just what the book of Revelation is saying. Mm. Just saying to people, like, right now you're being persecuted by big kingdoms all around you. And that is real, but it's not the end of the story. Mm. You are actually, even though the world sees you as a little put upon, persecuted person, heaven sees you as standing in the throne room of the King. Mm. So it's now, but not yet. The idea is like, the way you're living right now doesn't look like the fullness of the kingdom of God, but something real is happening to you right now.
Yeah.
And this is why we start to say things like Satan is always falling. One of the things you notice about Satan is that he falls quite a lot in the Bible, I mentioned last time. Mm. And that's one of the realities of Satan, is that he's present and he's around, and his rule and reign, people agree with it all the time. They live under the rule of Satan all the time. And it's always ending. There's always something new that's breaking forward.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Satan is himself in Revelation. He's a penultimate force, isn't he? He's kind of, he is almost. It's interesting. He isn't the last thing to be consumed to the second death, the kind of fiery furnace. He's the second to last thing, and the last thing is death. Death is the last thing to be put to death, and it's almost like Satan is himself, if anything, an emissary of this kind of force.
Yeah, he's partnering with something.
Yeah.
And Satan is always a figure associated with the ruling and reigning as well, and authority, and nations, the rise and fall of nations, and he's the prince of this age. So the Satan figure is very much a figure of the kingdoms of man.
Yeah.
Who use death, who are motivated by death, motivated by fear of death, and the ones that wage death on others all the time.
I would definitely say that if our reading this together has done anything to me, it's kind of reinforced that idea of the now and not yet, and it's significant, and almost in modern parlance, to double down on it, like to kind of take it extra seriously. It's not just.
I think it's a double down on it. Yeah, for sure. Because if you just say, "Oh, it was just a historical document to do with the Roman Empire," and so it's not relevant to us at all anymore, I think you're just utterly abandoning what the text was doing, which was saying Rome is one of many examples of the beast, and there's many more. So I think if we just said, "Oh, it's just a historical document that only means Rome, and now that we don't have Rome anymore, who cares?" I think you're totally missing the point. Likewise, if you just said, "Oh, it's just describing a future that hasn't happened yet, therefore we don't have to think there's a beast right now. We're just waiting for the beast to be born one day." You're totally missing the point.
Yeah.
That there is a beast that's always present.
Yeah. And that now they're not being a thoroughly political idea, as opposed to one that's about personal transformation or personal experience. Although those things aren't entirely separate to each other. But I think in the way that we often use it in the Vineyard, it's been about why haven't I experienced transformation in this part of my sort of life or private spirituality, as opposed to this now and the not yet stuff is about politics and the order of the world and authority and those kind of things.
And think about running. I mean, a lot of Christians right away hear that because we're addicted to running things. So a lot of people hear that kind of language and think, "Oh, that means it's our job to rule the nations." Yeah. It's not our job to rule the nations. And I've told you this before, we're given the rod of iron to smash the nations like pottery. That's what you do with them. Go look it up. It's in the book of Revelation. And so I don't think that our ultimate end is to one day rule the world. It's right now, what we're supposed to be doing is living right now as if our king is not Satan. Right? So we demonstrate new creation and new life by living in the kingdom of God, not the kingdom of Satan. And all the personal regeneration that you're talking about, which is really lovely, it doesn't happen by yourself. It only happens when you're bound to a culture that is helping to shape your imagination. And that is when you are part of a movement, a kingdom that is giving freely to you so that you can give freely to other people. If you're living in a kingdom where other people are speaking truth and words of life into you so that you can do that to other people, that's when you start to see personal transformation. But it starts with people living together well. It starts with the kingdom. It's not an individualistic thing. So, and the book of Revelation is all about people living together. Like it's about groups of people against other groups. It's not about individuals standing against the thing. It's about the martyrs or the sheep or all the different words for them, the elders, all the different types of people. But it's like a group of us are doing this, and we are set apart from the other groups who are doing other things. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen.